Hello and welcome to this video entitled ICD-10 Preparation in Uncertain Times. My name is Tyler, and this is a presentation that I delivered at a rural hospital conference in April of 2014. If you remember right, and who could forget, that was the time when the delay was just announced and there was no scheduled implementation date set. You'll find that the content of this presentation still applies today. For more videos like this, please head over to ruralicd10.com. All right, so let's get going. Here's an outline for this video. First, we'll talk about how ICD-10 cannot be managed like a typical project. It's a special challenge. If you choose to manage it like any other project, you're going to have a difficult time. Next, we'll look at one example of how we all plan for uncertainty. You already know how to plan for uncertainty. We just need to make that apply to ICD-10. And finally, I'll answer the question, how do we move forward without wasting time? Time is your most valuable resource. How can we plan in such a way that you can optimize your time and not waste any of it? So let's start with a typical project progression. Here it is. We'll look at it from a high level. Initiation is getting a team together, forming the project. Planning is where we map out the project. Execution is when items are implemented. The monitor phase is how we keep track of the project. And then we close the project and we pat ourselves on the back and move on to the next project. When we plan for a project, we start at the end. We set a deadline that we are trying to achieve, and then we work our way backwards. This allows us to spread out our resources and complete the project on time. Simple enough, right? Wrong. It's not going to work for ICD-10, and here's why. Welcome to ICD-10. This is our environment. I'm not going to say how many times ICD-10 has been delayed because I want this video to still be relevant and useful in 2018. I'm asked these questions all the time. Will the deadline be firm this time? Do you really think it could be delayed again? Will they cancel ICD-10 altogether? My response is always, I don't know. In all honesty, these questions don't matter. Let's not get bogged down in speculation. The only question that matters is, how do we implement ICD-10 with all of this uncertainty? That's the question, isn't it? Remember, on a typical project, we start at the end and work our way back. What do we do when we don't have the end date? Or what if the end date constantly changes? Well, let's switch gears for a minute. I want to tell you about a dinner party that I'm having. Everyone, please meet my good friend, Ben. Hi, Ben. Ben and his family are coming over for dinner tomorrow night. They're coming over at 6 p.m. to enjoy Ben's favorite dish, a chicken casserole. So to sum up, Ben and his family are coming to my house for chicken casserole at 6 p.m. How would I plan to make the chicken casserole? Well, I would start with the recipe. I'm looking at my recipe now. It looks like my prep time is 2 hours. My bake time is 1 hour for a total cooking time of 3 hours. I want my casserole to be perfect for Ben and his family, so I want it to be done right on time. So when do I need to start making my casserole? Well, let's work backwards. I know that he's going to arrive at 6 p.m., so I need to place the casserole in the oven to bake at 5 p.m. And then 2 hours before that, I know I need to get started with my prep work at 3 p.m. So I know that I need to start prep and the entire process at 3 p.m. Easy, right? Do you see what we did? We just started with the arrival time of 6 p.m. and worked our way backwards to get a start prep time at 3 p.m. Some of you go through this process on a daily basis. You plan your activities with the end in mind. But you know what? Life happens. Plans change. What if Ben calls me and says, hey, Tyler, tomorrow I've got to visit the in-laws in Atlanta. I know that we originally said that we could come over for dinner at 6 p.m. However, that's not going to happen. I'm not sure when we're coming over, but it will be sometime after 6. I will give you a call when we are an hour away from your house. So to sum up, Ben and his family have to visit his in-laws in Atlanta. They were coming over at 6, but now it's going to be sometime after 6. He doesn't know when. However, he's going to call me when he is an hour away from my house. So how do we plan with this uncertainty? Well, let's go back and start with our recipe. Did the recipe change? No, the recipe did not change. The prep time still takes 2 hours. The bake time still takes 1 hour for a total cooking time of 3 hours. So what did change? The arrival time changed. Because we do not know the arrival time, we do not know when to start the process. With our example here, what would you do? Well, let's look at two options. The first option that I'm going to go over is we're going to start the prep at 3 p.m. and prep until he calls. I don't know when Ben is going to call, so I'm going to stay on the safe side, and I'm just going to keep prepping until he does call. And besides, maybe the extra prep work will make the casserole taste all the better. Option 2 says that I should just pick a time after 3 p.m. to start the prep work. Since I don't know when Ben will call, I'm just going to guesstimate when he will be stopping by. And you know what? The last time when he came to visit, it was at 7. So I'm just going to go off that assumption. Regardless, I'm just going to start prepping sometime after 3 p.m. Which of these two options would you choose? Hopefully you would say neither. They're both bad options. Why in the world would I start prepping at 3 and continue prepping all the way until he calls? And why would I take a random guess as to when he arrives? So what would you do instead? Are there any other options? Of course there are. The third option is this. Let's start prepping at 3, put the casserole in the refrigerator, and then start the baking process whenever he calls. This is common sense. This allows me to optimize my time and not take any risks as to when he will arrive. Also, what's nice about this is that I can prep whenever I want to. Since I'm splitting the process between prep activities and bake activities, I can prep the casserole whenever I feel like it. If I want to prep the casserole from 10 until noon and then work or play until he calls that evening, I have that flexibility. Now, how does this apply to ICD-10? Remember, this is an ICD-10 video, not a cooking video. Well, with ICD-10, with planning in the delay, we have 3 options. So the first option is keep going. I remember when the ICD-10 delay was announced in April, it was general consensus that we quote unquote keep going. I'm not sure where we're going exactly if we're not working toward an endpoint, because remember, a project by definition has a start and end date. The second option is that we can procrastinate. Just minutes before I gave this presentation back in April, I was approached by a CIO. He was beaming and said proudly to me, "I guess with the delay, we made the right decision by not choosing to implement ICD-10. And you know, at the time, he was right. I couldn't argue with him. However, do you really want to gamble with your revenue cycle? You do know that eventually the house wins. With option 1 of quote unquote keep going, we run the risk of being burnt out. With option 2, we run the risk of being burned. Are we really stuck with these 2 options? Is there not a third? Well, of course there's a third option. The third option is this. We split the ICD-10 project into 2 parts, prep and cook. I call it the split project approach. You can call it the 2 project approach, dual project approach, whatever you want to call it. But let's see what the split project approach looks like. So here it is. I have the ICD-10 project broken down into phase 1, the prep phase, and phase 2, the cook phase. Let's look at phase 1. Phase 1, as we look in the first column, when to start, we need to start now or in the near future. What all is included with phase 1? Phase 1 includes all of our planning activities, which includes project formation, stakeholder analysis, a risk assessment, developing a project plan and a project schedule, analyzing ICD-9 workflows, updating IT systems, testing IT systems, coder training, and education. And how long will phase 1 last? Well, for a small rural or critical access hospital, generally speaking, it will take about 6 to 8 months. Now let's look at phase 2. This is where the split project approach is unique. We do not start phase 2 until 6 months from the deadline. Ideally, the federal government would not screw with the ICD-10 deadline if we are 6 months from go live. Maybe that's just me being optimistic. However, the major items included in Phase 2 are physician education, intense dual coding, and final testing of systems. In Phase 1, we need to be working up to these 3 major items. So for instance, for physician education, you need to have completed a baseline documentation analysis, you need to have completed an education plan, and you need to have all of your ICD-10 educational resources lined up and ready. We're not going to begin physician education until we are absolutely sure that the deadline is not going to change. For dual coding, you should have already completed a coder assessment, developed a skills gap analysis, and developed a dual coding plan. We want to wait until Phase 2 so we are not dual coding indefinitely. And this does not mean that you can open your encoder and play around with ICD-10, or that you can't generate ICD-10 test claims for testing with your clearinghouse. I'm not saying that at all, but for intense, systematic dual coding, you want to begin 6 months out. And finally, for final testing, you need to have updated all of your systems, tweaked your interfaces, updated your reports, and hopefully have already submitted claims with your clearinghouse. You want to test as much as possible in Phase 1 and leave the final testing in Phase 2. Do you see how this example applies to the cooking example? When we split the project this way, we can work on Phase 1 whenever we want to, and we don't work on Phase 2 until the deadline is firmly set. So what are the outcomes, or what can we expect when we utilize the split project approach? First, our resources are not going to be wasted. What happens currently if you work on the ICD-10 project for 8 months and then it's delayed again, and then you work for another 8 or 9 months and it's delayed again, and then you work for a year and then it's delayed again? When you get your prep work done, it doesn't matter when the deadline is set. You've already done the heavy lifting, and you're not risking rushing your resources by procrastination. If you procrastinate and keep banking on these delays, one of these times you're going to get burned and you're going to have to rush the implementation. And you know, the prep time or the prep work is not going to decrease by putting it off. It's not magically going to become a lighter load. Think back to our recipe. Did our recipe change? No, the recipe did not change. So Phase 1, the activities are not going to change if you delay. So it's best just to go ahead and get it over and done with now. And finally, your anxiety is going to drop. You don't care if the ICD-10 deadline is October 1st, 2015, 2016, 2017. It doesn't matter to you. You know what you need to do 6 months before the deadline. Now let's look at some exceptions. I should go ahead and say that there are a few exceptions to the split project approach. Clinical documentation should continue through this time. Personally, I do not put clinical documentation improvement under the scope of the ICD-10 project because it's not really a project activity. It's an ongoing improvement, so I categorize it under operations work and not project work. The same goes with general revenue cycle improvements. If you're working on improving your revenue cycle, that will benefit both ICD-9 and ICD-10, so don't stop those improvements. Like clinical documentation improvement, I do not consider this part of the ICD-10 project scope. And finally, with IT and software updates, if you were installing an encoder or moving to computer-assisted coding software, that does not have to fall into the split project approach. So in summary, go create a split project plan and see what that would look like. Phase 1 includes activities that can and should be done now. Phase 2 activities are those that should be done 6 months from the deadline, whatever that deadline may be. You have enough to worry about. Please don't let ICD-10 give you more anxiety than it has to. Let's remove uncertainty from the equation. That concludes the video. Thank you for watching. I hope I was able to provide some value as you navigate the ICD-10 transition. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email and introduce yourself. Also, please follow Rural ICD-10 on social media. We are on Twitter, Google+, and Facebook. Also, stop by our website for more resources and videos just like this.